presentation tool.
All right, I invite everyone to take their seats. We're about ready to get started. Okay, let's begin. My name is Sue Shalal, and I'm the designated federal officer for the Science Advisory Board Hexavalent Chromium Review Panel. This is the third day of our meeting, and I just want to recap a few of our administrative remarks, reminding folks that the SAB is an independent expert federal advisory committee chartered under the authority of FACA, or the Federal Advisory Committee Act, where all of our deliberations take place in public. All of our members are appointed to their positions as special government employees, and as such are subject to all applicable ethics laws and implementing regulations. And in reviewing confidential financial disclosure forms and other information about members' involvement in the development of materials that are the subject of the advisory activity, EPA determined that these advisors have no financial conflicts of interest or appearance of a lack of impartiality under Ethics Regulations 5 CFR 2635. So with that, I think we will probably be able to complete our deliberations today in less time than expected. So for those who are listening in, again, you can access the video live stream by going to epa.gov/SAB, going to the place where meetings are listed. If you go to today's meeting page, you will find the link for the live stream. And so with that, I'll hand it off to Dr. Morris, the chair of the panel, to go through today's agenda. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. I think we made good progress yesterday, and we've just got a few of the remaining questions under charge question 6 to deal with today. So I think we will do that, and then we'll provide an opportunity for the lead discussants to raise any questions they might have while we're all together, just to make sure that we're all in the same page and clarifying any type 1, tier 1 or tier 2 comments that we might have. After we finish that discussion, there'll be a few moments for some clarifying public comments, in case there are any to be had, and then we will call it a day. So I think I'll turn it over to Dr. Eastman. I think he might have a couple of clarifying things to do with some of our earlier parts of question 6, and then we'll move forward. Dr. Eastman?
Okay. Thank you. So we're continuing on charge question 6, which has to do with mode of action and low-dose extrapolation and age-dependent adjustment factors, et cetera. So in question A, just to summarize, the committee felt strongly that a mutagenic mode of action was supported and relevant to humans, and continued on looking at discussing whether sort of approaches that should be used for the low-dose extrapolation, and there was a vote taken to recommend to the EPA, let me pull this up if I can find it, that the EPA further consider using toxicokinetic considerations, and so specifically dose dependency and chromium accumulation in low-dose extrapolation for the oral route of exposure. And there was strong support for that particular statement going forward. Before we jump into our charge question C, I did receive a request for clarification by email, and it had to do with the comment about that was made, which had to do with the evidence for the cytotoxic or regenerative hyperplasia mode of action. And the individual asked the question, was hoping for some clarification. He thought that that was a blanket statement, and I thought it referred specifically to the rat oral cavity. And that was the sort of thing. And I didn't know if whoever made that comment remembers it and wants to clarify that.
Do you mean rat oral cavity or mouse gastrointestinal tumors, or I'm not sure?
No, well, so I think there's sufficient evidence, certainly, for the cytotoxic regenerative hyperplasia mechanism mode of action that's occurring in the mouse intestine.
Oh, okay.
Okay? I think the comment, I think that's in the document and pretty clearly laid out. And certainly the public comments have very much supported that approach. And I think we recognize that may be going on. In fact, some of the comments from reviewers said that it was a belief that two modes of action were occurring, and we carried forward. I mean, Barbara, I think that was one of your comments. So I think that's in the document. I think the comment was specifically, the comment was, there wasn't evidence for that in the rat oral cavity.
Right.
And that was, but I just want to make sure if that, if I'm incorrect, or please clarify that's what I'm hoping to do, and if not.
That was what I remember reading in the document, but can we ask EPA what the document says about it? Because
Hi, yes, that's correct. There's no histopathological evidence from the rat oral cavity for any of the cytotoxic or proliferative effects.
But there is evidence in the intestine, clearly.
Yes, yes.
one of my comments,
And I think one of the public commenters mentioned the forestomach, I think,
Okay.
but that was in a different short term.
one of my comments was that in the appendix, I think it said maybe it wasn't meant that way, but there was no information on the mode of action of rat oral, and that wasn't consistent with what you just said. That's in the main document, but okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Catherine. Okay, I hope, does that address the answer sufficiently? Is that, if not, please speak up. Okay. Well, let's move on. I'll move on to, so charge question 6C. Let me read it. It says, EPA concluded that for cancer via the oral route of exposure, chromium-6 is likely to be carcinogenic to the human GI tract. This conclusion is primarily based on robust evidence of cancer from a high-confidence 2-year cancer bioassay conducted by the National Toxicology Program, which showed a statistically significant increase in oral cavity tumors in male and female Fisher 344/N rats and small intestine neoplasms in male and female B63F1 mice. So I guess if there are people, I guess to summarize, I don't think anyone really questioned that. I think there was pretty strong support for that approach. But if others feel otherwise, please, let's discuss it now.
Can you summarize, please, if, everyone said we agree, or were there any comments? So can you maybe go through your, maybe that would be the best way. Because we received comments by member rather than by question, and there's 100.
Well, I received 76 pages on this one, so picking out, it's going to take a little, it's probably easier to just go to the committee members and
maybe
say,
you can call on
did anyone have, I'll look for it, but any specific concerns about this particular one? Feel that this conclusion by the EPA was not valid and should be.
Can you start with your own comment?
Sure. I mean, I kind of did. I said, I think the evidence certainly supports the EPA's conclusion that the tumors that we're seeing in the basically mouse small intestine, let me go back to this. It's kind of tricky to keep bouncing between documents, but okay. So I think the conclusion, I mean, I think it's the increases that we're seeing in the oral cavity tumors in male and female rats, I think were statistically significant. And similar with the small intestine, the tumors seen in male and female B63 on mice were significant and pretty strong. I do believe those were caused by Chromium 6 that was treated. And it would seem to me that barring evidence to the contrary, that data would be, the information that was seen in these animals would be relevant to humans. So that's my take on this. If anyone would like to agree or feel differently, please weigh in.
I'll agree with you.
I agreed in my comments that it fulfilled the criteria for likely.
Thanks, Gloria. Anthony.
Yeah, I agree too. Important point here, 2 species, both sexes and both species at different sites within GI tract. So that's make a strong rationale that is, and considering that Chromium 6 can enter all kinds of cells, that makes a strong case that it is likely. Chromium 6 is carcinogenic in the GI tract to humans.
Dr. Eastman, perhaps I said the most in this regard. I'm not sure. I do say that the lab animal data suggests that assuming sufficiently high oral exposure over a sufficiently long duration, Chromium 6 exposure has the ability to cause GI tract tumors in the general population. So I agreed with that also. I go on to say, this being said, human data, even in occupationally exposed, do not appear to this non-epidemiologist as particularly strong for demonstrating such exposure conditions and effects based on EPA's meta-analyses. So I do make that comment, but then on the other hand, EPA's conclusion is based primarily on the rodent evidence.
Thank you. Any others that would like to weigh in from the committee in general? Okay.
I agree.
Okay. Thanks, Max. So I think we are in agreement with this particular. We think that we are supportive of the EPA conclusions on certainly the relevance of the the cancers of the gastrointestinal tract and their relevance to humans. So I'll move on unless other discussion is necessary or someone believes it's necessary at this point. So charge question 6D, a point of departure from the National Toxicology Program, 2008, a 2-year drinking water bioassay in rodents was selected to calculate the total lifetime oral slope factor for Chromium 6 of 0.5 per milligram per kilogram per day, based on increased incidence of adenomas and carcinomas in the small intestine of male and female mice. This value includes the application of age-dependent adjustment factors. So I guess we are supposed to discuss really whether we feel that the data has been clearly and appropriately synthesized and discuss any strengths and limitations to that approach and conclusion. Anyway, I can open it. I mean, if I'll start out, we'll ask people for their comments. Certainly this may be influenced by if the EPA, as we talked about, goes back and does further examination of the toxicokinetics and finds that a better point of departure, a different approach is warranted, then that might change things. But given what we're looking at here, I think that the approach they've taken is certainly consistent with EPA guidelines. It's a health conservative approach to looking at things. And I think there is appropriate justification for using an age-dependent adjustment factor given the information we've received, with, as I said, the caveat that if they find new information as they do reassess this, they would re-examine it. But that's my approach. Others would like to weigh in.
The only comment I would have is that, as we've discussed, this is dependent on the mutagenic mode of action from Section A, so I just think it might be clear to say using the mutagenic mode of action, the ADAF is appropriate, just to make it clear that those two are linked together.
Okay, that's fine.
I was going to wait for the people assigned to it.
What's that?
I was going to wait for the people assigned to it to give their comments.
Feel free to jump in, Gloria. Or Dr. Zitkovich.
Not much. I fully agree with what Dr. Eastman said. So.
I agree as well.
I agree too, but I just had a couple of comments, clarification. Well, one is clarification and one's about application of the ADAF. The clarification is just the way I noted the lines and stuff where it said it. I think it says that the slope factor of 0.3, which was later adjusted, was from male and female mice, but what it really was like someone might think that it was based on an analysis of the tumors from both sexes combined, and I was just suggesting they state that both the males and the females resulted in the same number, just to clarify that. It's in my comments, but as far as the ADAFs, I think my numbers are reversed in my preliminary comments, and I'll fix it, but when you apply ADAFs, it's really for exposure from different media, and you have to combine it with age-dependent exposure factors if it's for a drinking water number or a soil ingestion number. We're doing it for fish consumption for surface water criteria in New Jersey. There's and that's how it's intended to be applied, because the factors are to multiply the risk by certain factors for different age periods in early life. So it states that in the guidance for doing this, I'm sorry, that it's to be used for higher susceptibility during early life with age-specific exposure assumptions specific to the exposure medium and pathway of concern. There's examples of this in EPA documents, 2 examples that I'm aware of, and they're cited in my comments. For the IRIS document on trichloroethylene, they use it with age-specific drinking water ingestion rates, and also for 1,2,3 trichloropropane, the Office of Water did it for health reference levels, and we have that in our New Jersey trichloropropane document. I cited it, but it was received from the Office of Water. So in other words, if you were doing it a soil, the slope factor is adjusted based on those exposure assumptions. So the slope factor they didn't adjust, they just assumed the same exposure for all of different age periods. your slope factor is going to be different when you your overall slope factor for the whole life period is going to be different for water exposure or soil exposure. And also it should be stated that in the document that's for whole life exposure, and if there was a scenario where there's shorter exposure during just the adult period, that doesn't apply. That would be the unadjusted slope factor. It's for whole life exposure. So basically, I feel that has to be, that's what the guidance says, and that's how it's intended to be used, and I really feel it has to be included in the revised draft.
So if I can clarify, so you believe that in addition to the current age-dependent adjustment factor, an additional adjustment factor should be applied to deal with media?
They're applied along with, they're applied in conjunction in the equation with, it's like for a certain amount of years, so much per, many liters per kilogram per day. And it's all in one equation, but you don't just adjust the slope, the risk, the slope factor by that. I think it's tenfold higher in the earliest period and threefold or whatever. Along with that, you adjust the exposure during that period.
So
it's shown in some, and you can, okay.
So, I mean, I think I understand what you're saying is because infants consume more or drink more water per body weight on a body weight basis, that they would have a higher risk as well, that would be in addition to the additional
Right, when
risk
you're developing, those factors can be used. When I've seen it before, it wasn't one slope factor, like it went from 0.3 to 0.5, the way it's presented in this document. It was when you apply age, the starting slope factor is 0.3, and when you develop a water criteria for chronic exposure, these factors are applied, and then it comes along with the adjustments in the equation. And same with soil, because the children ingest more soil, and the standard equations used in the Superfund that states use too, and so there's like a higher soil ingestion rate for kids, but the ratio is different. It's not the same proportion between older and younger for drinking water and soil, so it's going to be different.
So my impression, this is sort of Barbara?
I'm thinking one way to characterize it simply is to say to use appropriate age adjustment, exposure, and media-specific factors.
But the slope factor really isn't their final slope factor is 0.5, correct? And after they adjusted, is that right? It was it isn't really 0.5, it's something else. They just adjusted, they just used those factors for first, like if it was first 6 years and then 10 years to adjust the slope factor. And I don't think that's really meaningful, because it depends on what route you're talking about.
Well, I mean, the issue for me is that this is a lifetime cancer risk. And so they've adjusted for the period that takes place, sort of early young,
And
very
then the
young,
next period.
a little bit older, and then the adult approach. And so that's been folded in because it's a lifetime exposure. What I think you would recommend is when this is applied at the office level, say the Office of Water, or others that deal with this.
Or waste.
That they would also consider, when they do this, using appropriate adjustments to account for increased exposure in early life.
That's true, and then the overall slope factor wouldn't be 0.5 it would be something else.
They could modify it. Yeah, they would
Well, it would just
modify
come
it.
out, well, maybe it's just me, but I don't see what using it with, I just can't wrap my head around what using it without exposure factors for different periods even means, like you just said. Maybe I just can't understand it, but maybe it's just me.
But I think that if we at least make it clear that this is lifetime, and then when we're talking less than lifetime, which could be,
No,
0
even
to
for
6, it could be
lifetime.
adolescence, it could be whatever, in a site-specific situation that you need to make the appropriate adjustments, which implies a different slope factor.
But even for lifetime, say like it was being used to develop a slope factor for chronic drinking water exposure, I think the periods are 0 to 6 years and 6 to 16 years, but I might be wrong, is that right? And then 16 to 70 years, something like that, is that right? I can't remember. Then you would do like the time-weighted average water ingestion rate for 0 to 6 years, and along with that factor, which I think is 10 times, and then plus or like 10 years, 6 years for that, and 10 years for the time-weighted average of 6 to 16 years times the factor, and then if you're doing it up to 70 years or 35 years, however many years of not adjusted divided by the whole period, and that's what your slope factor that you use for your chronic drinking water is. That's how the office, that's how it was done, and somebody can look at the how they did it in the IRIS trichloroethylene assessment, and also the trichloropropane Office of Water.
Maybe we can get some
assessment.
clarification from EPA here.
Okay,
Yeah,
thanks.
just a quick clarification. So the age groups are 0 to 2
Sorry.
is the highest ADAF, 2 to 16, and then 16 to adulthood.
And it's like 10 and 3, is that right?
It's 10, 3, and then 1.
Right.
Right.
And those are supposed to be applied, on a, exposure specific and life and scenario specific.
Right, but,
Like you
so
said.
so that's what I've been saying, and it sounds like you agree, but nowhere it just was adjusted by those 10 and 3, for 2 years and 14 years, but nowhere does it say anything about that when it's being used for a media-specific criterion, that it needs to be used in conjunction with exposure factors, and the slope factor will be different. So all I'm saying is that needs to be, and maybe if you want, you could give an example of using like the current EPA drinking water rates for different age groups if you want, just to show. That would, because people don't understand that unless they work with it. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I mean, right now we have a very, very, very simple example. So we could just, mention that, there'll be different exposure factors for different, media.
Could you maybe
scenarios.
provide an example, just so someone, like use what's in the trichloroethylene document as a model, maybe?
Sure. I mean, I think someone I think Region 2 or something actually sent us an example like this. So
Well, it's in
pretty,
the IRIS document, from 2011, I think.
Okay.
And also the Office of Water did it. Like, it's cited in my comments, you can see. Okay. And I guess that, yeah.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I don't think one needs to get into a lot of the details, but you might want to also note that it's something that is different for soil and water, and that it's something for the risk assessors to be aware of.
Right. But if you show it for water, someone else can see how you could do it for soil to just, yeah. Okay.
And Dr. Post, in my comments, I cite New Jersey's comment on this and concurred with that to have some additional calculations to perhaps make the values more useful in risk assessment for something like Superfund based on human risk assessments. Now, when things get plugged into the EPA's RSL calculator, the ADAFs will be automatically applied in that calculator in conjunction with exposure factors. So that will be available to people. So I just want to note that.
Yeah, but the way the document's written, it doesn't, as far as I remember, it doesn't highlight that the original slope factor is, I don't know if they would just put 0.5 in the RSL table, because that's what's in all the summaries, that the slope factor is. It's 0.3, and then they're applied, and that calculator would do it like if as you said, I didn't know it automatically does that. So it just has to be clear that the starting one is 0.3, and it depends how you apply the ADAFs, what your final slope factor is going to be.
I think because of the determination that the Chromium 6 is acting through a mutagenic mode of action, that initial slope factor has been adjusted for the ADF based on mutagenicity, and that raises up to 0.5. What you're talking about is additional.
That's how the ADAF should have been applied because of the mutagenicity.
Yeah, and that's what has been done.
No, can somebody else explain it maybe?
Yeah.
And it's because of mutagenic mode of action.
But if you're exposed in periods other than 0 to 2, 2 to 16, 16 through 70, the adjustment needs to be different. So let's say you're exposed just ages 2 to 16, you wouldn't have the 10-fold adjustment from 0 to 2, and you wouldn't have the 1-fold adjustment from 16 to adult. You would just have the 3-fold adjustment. So the age of the receptor determines what the adjustment is, and not to get too much into risk exposure assessment complexities, the exposure assumptions vary for the different age groups, which don't necessarily map between 0 to 2, 2 to 16, and 16 to adult. So it's just something that I think people need to be aware that this value is based on lifetime. And if it's less than lifetime, there needs to be.
No, but even if it's lifetime for, like chronic drinking water standards and guidelines are based normally on chronic exposure. As you said, when you adjust for mutagenicity, you have, with applying the ADAFs along with it for a lifetime, you apply the higher exposure from 0 to 2 along with the factor of 10. So it's really, and then you, because when you develop drinking water standards, ingestion rates considered in the equation, you put the different ingestion rates along with the adjustment for higher susceptibility for each age period, and then and that comes, and it won't be 0.5, it'll probably be higher because the ingestion and the risk are higher in early life, even for a lifetime. Is it possible to like show something on the screen just so I can show how it was shown in the TCE document, or not? Is that not necessary, or we can look it up? So people can look it up later. I don't know what we wanted.
I don't know.
Dr. Post, I think it would be above and beyond, but just as an idea for EPA, larger picture type idea. It seems to me that it would be great if EPA just put an online calculator on their website where people can put in an oral slope factor and the media and the age range you're wanting, and then I think it'd be simple to implement, and then it could show the adjusted slope factor.
Oh, that's a different. I don't know if IRIS would do that. I would just suggest that in their document it's noted that the adjusted slope factor is going to be different for different media, because it's going to be the adjustment factors are combined with age-specific exposure factors, and the overall slope factor for lifetime, if it starts for your whole life from early life, will not necessarily be the same for all media. If that,
I think this is John. I think you just encapsulated the fundamental point, that it needs more clarity as you just described, and then we'll let them handle how they provide that clarity.
okay, fine, thank you.
Thank you. Any more discussion or comments on this point?
I'll go a little bit more into my comments. I reiterate some of the things I had said before about other endpoints, where I think there should be some attempt at scientific justification of the laboratory animal species selected for the oral slope factor. I cite EPA cancer guidelines that say when multiple estimates can be developed, all data sets should be considered and a judgment made about how best to represent the human cancer risk. So I think that falls in line with the comment that I just made, and also reiterate, EPA wanting to address in the uncertainty section of the main document about the choice of the most appropriate lab animal species and the fact that there's not, for example, international consensus on the mode of action. So those are some of the comments I'd like to highlight out on my own.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments on this particular point? Okay, if not, we'll move on to charge question 6E. Okay, okay. So let me read it, and then I know we'll have a little more discussion on this one as well. The inhalation unit risk, IUR, was based on an occupational cohort by Gibb et al., 2020, 2015, 2000B, of chromate production workers at a facility in Baltimore, Maryland. Cox proportional hazard modeling of cumulative chromium exposure and lung cancer risk with exposure lagged by 5 years was used to estimate the point of departure at the exposure concentration that would cause a 1% extra risk of lung cancer in the US population, resulting in an inhalation unit risk for chromium-6 of 2 × 10⁻² per microgram chromium-6 per meter cubed, including application of age-dependent adjustment factor. So maybe we should start out, Edwin, you want to start out with your comment on that?
Sure. Yeah, I just
Well, maybe I should sort of summarize things, and then from my perspective, I think that there was support for the approach that EPA used. There were questions or a few comments here from those who reviewed it, generally supported, I think. And if not, please speak up. And I have a question or comment or two as well, but Edwin, would you go forward?
Sure. I sent a late submission comment to you this morning. So this is not necessarily in disagreement with the charge question itself, but I think the EPA should discuss a recent publication by Behrens, which is a case control study of 14 studies, a pooled analysis from Europe and Canada. It was actually accepted for publication last July, but didn't. It has a 2023 citation, and I didn't see it in HERO or HAWK. It is, as I said, it's a case control study, a pooled case control study, almost 17,000 lung cancer cases and 21,000 controls as far as case control studies go. And I would prefer cohort studies over case control studies, but as far as case control studies go, this is probably state of the art. They used a measurement-based job exposure matrix estimated for job, year, region-specific exposure levels to chromium-6, which were linked to subjects' occupational histories. And this job exposure matrix was described in detail by Peters, which is in HERO. So the average exposure in the study among controls is 40 microgram per meter cube years among men and 26 microgram per meter cube years among women. So in that sense, you know, one of the criticisms of the literature is it's cohort studies that have higher exposures and we need more lower exposure studies. I think this one would qualify even though it's not a cohort study. But it's much lower exposures than the Painesville and Baltimore cohorts. And other aspects that make the study worth discussing is that they controlled for smoking in pack years, and they also analyzed exposure response relationships with chromium for never, former, and current smokers separately in strata. So that's, I think, addresses one of the comments that Dr. Eastman had about these cohort studies where most lung cancers were found among smokers. So here they were able to analyze smoking in a little bit more detail. They were able to stratify analyses for men and women, although for women the analysis was limited by a small sample size among exposed women, so there's not a lot of power there, wide confidence intervals. Among men, those exposure response associations appear to be consistent with results from the cohort studies, at least that's what the authors said. I think EPA should probably look at these results and confirm that that's the case. Among women, this study didn't really find any associations, not statistically significant ones. This study also used cubic spline analyses to explore the shape of the exposure response curve and observed linear associations for chromium-6. Again, looking at lower dose linearity, and they didn't find any suggestion that the association would deviate from linearity. They also adjusted for nickel. This paper was a study of nickel and chromium, and the chromium results did not get influenced by nickel exposure. And then, of course, this, again, it's a case control study with retrospective exposure assessment using a job exposure matrix that's based on exposure measurements across 14 different studies and countries. So there's limitations associated with that, and the authors acknowledged that and said that there might be some differential bias which could have unpredictable results or effects on the associations. It could result in bias towards the null or away from the null. So there are some limitations there. But my main comment is this study is, at least it's different from the two studies that have historically been used. And it provides a nice complement, and I think you can look at this. It provides some results that I think you can use in risk assessment. They actually compared their findings to some European agencies and their dose response and risk assessment inhalation unit risk findings and say that they're compatible. So I think it would be, I think it should be a tier 1 recommendation that they discuss this paper because it adds some things that the cohort studies don't have, like low exposures, adjustment for smoking, confirming linearity of the dose response.
Thank you. That partially addresses one of the questions I had. One of my concerns I had about the Gibb et al. Series of papers were that 76%, I believe, anyway, roughly 75% of the individuals involved in the study were cigarette smokers. And of those that it says that all but 4, basically, of those who developed cancer were smokers. So you have 98% of the individuals develop cancer during the study were smokers. And so it suggests to me that we may be seeing the same thing you see with some other agents, of the interaction between smoking and an environmental agent, in this case chromium-6. And that could have an influence in the results. So the understanding that there's another case control study out there that has a little better control for smoking, has a much lower smoking rate and gives similar results, I think is encouraging. And then we heard from the public comments about another cohort study that's taking place right now, I guess in California, in which their initial results seem to be quite consistent with these other cohorts. The earlier cohorts is encouraging. But as I guess you probably are aware that there's some very well-known interactions between cigarette smoking and environmental exposures, in one case asbestos, in which there's really a synergistic increase in risk of lung cancer if someone's exposed to both asbestos and is a cigarette smoker. And I think there's a similar type of risk as seen with esophageal cancer and cigarette smoking. I think alcohol is the other one. But anyway, there are a couple of these. And my only comment really for the document is I looked at this, I scanned through it again. There's extensive comments about this in the document, so it's not like I haven't done it. But for me, the simplest thing which I would like to see is, of the exposed, how many of those were smokers and how many were non-smokers? And of the controls that developed lung cancer, how many of these were smokers and non-smokers? And it may be in there, but I couldn't find it easily. And for me, that's pretty basic. You know, it's just sort of, are these exposures occurring? Are the lung cancers showing up? Well, as I said, 98% of them are in the smokers, but anyway, just for simplicity, it would be easy for me to see that sort of table, but this percentage is showing up among those chromium-exposed workers that were cigarette smokers, non-smokers, and then in controls, cigarette smokers, non-smokers. I would like to see that just for my own benefit, but maybe it's there. So any other comments or questions?
Yeah, can I make a comment?
Zivkovic.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point when you're just looking at a single study, ask a question whether there is interaction between smoking and chromium. Obviously, this newest study actually addressed never smokers, former smokers, and current smokers, and they found excess risk of lung cancer for chromium even among never smokers. So it's a clear evidence that chromium carcinogenic by itself. Something which addresses this issue further is actual molecular analysis of chromate-associated cancers. They have very unusual phenotype. All of them essentially have wild-type P53 and more than 80% microsatellite instability, which is very uncommon for lung cancers. Tobacco smoker-associated cancer usually have mutated P53 and it's adenocarcinoma. For chromium, it's a squamous cell carcinoma, wild-type P53, and microsatellite instability. So that from a molecular point of view, chromate-associated cancer look very different than tobacco-associated cancers. It wasn't mentioned anywhere in Aris review, maybe because nobody posed a question about smoking.
Yeah. That's actually very interesting. I mean, personally, I find that very interesting. I would be interested in finding out more about it.
I just wanted to follow up on what Dr. Zivkovic was saying. It seems that those articles should be mentioned as articles that EPA missed isn't quite right, but it wasn't within the framework to consider that, but it seems as those would be useful articles to provide.
I agree, I just don't know in which place.
Well, one of the challenges is that the natures of the tumors caused by lung cancer has changed over time, and it's thought to be due to the changes in the composition of the cigarettes. So that, anyway, and so really you're looking at when were these studies done and what were the predominant types of cancer seen in cigarette smoking at that period of time. So it actually becomes sort of complicated if you're looking at the pathology to try and make a conclusion. But anyway, I would be quite interested personally just to see that evidence because I find it intriguing from a mechanistic perspective.
I can put those references in my comments.
Thank you. Are there other comments or questions? I mean, I guess the specifically going back to the overarching charge question is, do we feel like that the data have been clearly and appropriately synthesized for the inhalation risks and that the strengths and limitations have been in support of the conclusions have been presented, and we feel like the weight of evidence decisions are appropriate for the inhalation risk? It's kind of interesting because they really didn't reevaluate this from a hazard identification point of view. They said, this has been clearly established. We're not going to re-examine this from a hazard identification point of view. We're just going to more or less re-examine and update from a dose response perspective. So anyway, that's the way I would interpret what the EPA has done. But any concerns, questions about the approach that they used? My impression is they did the best they could with the data they had. There's some new data coming out which could maybe strengthen what they're doing and fill in some gaps, but my guess is it's not going to appreciably change much.
Right, and that's why I was initially a little hesitant when the direction said, well, only suggest new studies if it's going to make a difference. I don't know if it's going to make a difference, but I think it should be included just because it is such a different kind of study from what's historically been used for risk assessment, and I do think it fills some gaps and it might confirm or strengthen the conclusions that EPA has made.
I think it's really important in terms of considering the environmentally relevant exposure levels. Yes, Dr. Rusin.
Yeah, I think it's, again, very appropriate to suggest, but also, as Dr. Eastman was saying, it's consistent with the current practice because publications are rolling out, but the agency needs to have cutoff date for the main document. But as they perform additional searches while the document is percolating through the system, it is very important for panels like this to suggest additional things for them to consider. But to go back and reevaluate everything, that's really not what we're suggesting, and I think it's quite appropriate for us to do so.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
I have a few
Okay.
comments on mine I'd like to highlight here.
Go for it.
Some smaller points. So among my comments, I talk about section 4458 of the uncertainty section, and that indicates that the points of departure were within the minimum exposure level, which is 0, and the 25th percentile from table 2 of Gibb et al. And so I write, while technically true, I'm not sure that including exposure estimates of 0 for unexposed workers in a cohort is what the cancer guidelines envisions when evaluating whether a POD is, quote, near the lower end of the observable range, end quote. And so I suggest that EPA attempt to use cohort-specific information for the exposed to confirm consistency with the EPA cancer guidelines that the POD at a BMR of 1% extra risk is, quote, near the lower end of the observed range without significant extrapolation to lower doses. So anyway, I'm suggesting that they take a look at that part of the uncertainty section. And then also section 4432 that indicates that part of the reason that the Cox proportional hazards model was selected for the inhalation unit risk is that results from this type of model, the Cox model, have been used as the basis for EPA unit risk derivations for breast cancer and lymphohematopoietic cancer. And they cite the specific example as being the ethylene oxide average assessment. However, the results of the Cox proportional hazards model were rejected by EPA as the basis for these inhalation unit risks in the ethylene oxide assessment. So this reason should be removed as part of the justification for the Cox model. And so those are the comments I wanted to highlight here.
Thank you. Let me just kind of reiterate I've been trying to take notes, but it's actually very difficult to listen, take notes, and figure out what is going forward. So undoubtedly, I will have missed a lot. So key points that you would like to have included, please write them up and send them to me as a follow-up, or if they were in your original comments, you can highlight what those were, just to help me in summarizing this, these sections. Thank you. So is there any more discussion to be had on this point?
So sorry to have more comments, but the second, at the beginning of the charge question part, the introduction before the A, B, C, and D, there was, like it said, in addition to answering A, B, C, D below, please comment on certain things, and I put those comments at the end of my comments on the A, B, so I just...
Feel free to bring them up now.
Some of them are clarifications, so I'm not going to go over them, but some, I just marked a few. Some are clarifications, just to clarify more points, but the ones I wanted to bring up. So in the document, there was a confidence section for the reference dose and the reference concentration, but there wasn't a confidence section and a confidence descriptor for the reference dose high and RFC overall confidence medium, but there was not a similar statement and descriptor for the slope factor and the inhalation unit risk. And I thought I believe that normally there would be, so I looked at some other iris carcinogen assessments, and they did have confidence sections and descriptors, so I wasn't, there is a discussion of uncertainties for the slope factor, but I was recommending that a confidence statement be added unless there was a reason that they didn't do that. Another comment, wait. When they talked about the uncertainty factors for the oral slope factor, they said it was the same as for the reference dose, so they didn't have a separate discussion of uncertainties for the slope factor, but I think they were referring to the studies and the toxicokinetic methods, but I thought that there should be, you know, an allusion to other uncertainties that are specific to the cancer and linear low dose extrapolation, not just say it's the same as the reference dose. Another comment is for sensitive subpopulations in the table where they were talking about different things and different factors. It doesn't say for ADAFs is one of the parameters in the table. It doesn't say that available data indicate a higher susceptibility in early life, and that's the reason to apply them. That's more of a clarification. My last comment is in the appendix, there's alternative mode of action sections for both the small intestinal tumors and the rat oral tumors. They compared the dose using the slope factor that results in a 1 in 10,000 risk to the reference dose. And I think that's, I'm not sure why 1 in 10,000 risk was chosen, but maybe that could be clarified. I think that's appropriate for the small intestinal tumors because as we discussed, there's two potential, or they could be acting together modes of action, but they also use the reference dose based on the effects in the small intestine in mice to compare to the 1 in 10,000 risk of rat oral tumors, which are not, nobody's saying that there's an alternative, not threshold mode of action, and I didn't think it was appropriate to use an alternative mode of action analysis like that, using the reference dose for the intestinal tumors in mice for comparison with the risk of oral tumors. I didn't think that was appropriate, so I suggested it be removed. That's my last comment.
Okay, so let me try to, are there any other comments? I think that there'll be a chance, what I'd probably do is comments on question 6E, and then we'll probably go to comments in general, some of what
I
Gloria
thought we did E, I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah, well, that's
Sorry
fine.
about
No, I just want to make sure we're finished. Some of that was related to E, so it's okay.
I got confused.
Is that, okay?
I just
Dr.
want
Beck?
to make sure I understand Dr. Post's comment. So there's a comparison of the cancer risk using the oral slope factor.
The dose at 1 in
The dose
10,000.
at 1 in
The dose that
10,000.
results in 1 in 10,000.
And how that compares to the reference dose.
Because they're both doses, so they could be compared.
Right.
So they have a different slope factor of 0.1 for, I don't think it's adjusted with, I'm not sure if it's adjusted with ADAFs or not, but it's less stringent for oral tumors in the rats, and they didn't use it because it was less stringent, I guess. But they also compared the reference dose for the gastrointestinal.
With the 10 to the -4th dose.
I think it's appropriate to compare it. I don't know why 1 in 10,000 is used, but just accepting that that's appropriate. I think it's appropriate to do that for the gastrointestinal tumors in mice because the reference dose is based on the same endpoint, and we're talking about two different modes of action, but I didn't see why it was relevant or appropriate to compare it to the dose that causes a 1 in 10,000 risk of rat oral cavity tumors that they're concluding the only mode of action is mutagenic, and it's a different endpoint. That's all. It's,
yeah, I understand.
Barbara, it's on page D31 of the appendix if you want. It's not a very long section.
I do think, I agree with you that comparing the rat oral
The risk.
but I do think that it provides an important perspective, which I hadn't really considered till you brought it up, that the risk, the dose associated with the reference dose is equivalent to a 10 to the -4 cancer risk.
Well, it's not equivalent, they compared it. They said that, it's very short.
And I just want,
The nonlinear RFD-based estimate is 4.5 times higher than the 1 in 10,000 risk for the, using the 0.5 slope factor for
Okay.
GI, for intestinal tumors, and it was 1.5 times higher than the dose for the oral tumors. It's it's 1.5, less than 2 pages long, and it's on D31 and D32.
I do think that the comparison of the risk at the reference dose is relevant because typically the risk range that's used for site remediation is 1 in a million to 1 in 10,000. So using 1 in 10,000 as a comparison is reasonable. And I think from a perspective
It's in the
that
same
comparing the
range.
risk at the reference dose for cancer is a useful comparison. So I agree with you. I just didn't understand what was being said originally.
So it's 4.5 times higher, the reference dose, than the 1 in 10.
Is that in the appendix or in the body?
It's in Appendix D31D.
Okay. I would
D31 to 32.
I think that should be in the main body because people will miss it in the appendix. So I think it helps provide an understanding, assuming the no threshold model, what the cancer risk would be at the reference dose.
And you agreed that the part about the oral tumors isn't?
Yeah, I think the oral tumors, it's apples and
Because it's a
oranges.
different-
Yeah,
right.
you can't compare them.
Okay.
So let me wrap up just on the 6E. It's my impression there's strong support for the approach that the EPA has taken in estimating the risks of chromium-6 exposure in the low-dose region, and support for the choice of the occupational cohort that they chose, and the derivation of their point of departure and their inhalation unit risk calculations. So I think unless others feel otherwise, would basically go forward and say we do support that. Now, are there other comments or questions related to charge question 6 that we ought to visit about, talk about?
Real quick, because 6E mentions the ADAFs for inhalation, I just want to say, according to what EPA's done before, they assumed exposure was the same at all ages for inhalation route, so you don't need to do age-dependent exposure adjustments for inhalation. The way they did the factors, I agree with, because they don't need to consider different exposures at different ages, that as far as how
Are
they've
you
done
talking
it.
about media type?
Yeah, inhalation exposure, they assumed is the same, how they did it is the same at all ages, so you don't need to adjust for different amounts of inhalation exposure in younger and older ages.
Yeah, I mean,
That's fine.
this is basically, inhalation unit risk is used and essentially multiplied against a lifetime exposure concentration. So it kind of takes into account exposures at all ages, and so they derive the lifetime risk. So presumably in the calculations of exposure, that's been factored in.
I'm sorry, I really don't want to keep repeating it because it probably doesn't matter, but the age-dependent adjustment factors are used for lifetime risk.
No, I understand that.
I just want to
It's lifetime risk.
But even when you adjust for the different, like what we were talking about for water and stuff, it's for light, but for air, they're just saying the exposure, you don't need to adjust for different, like that say, like because of a different breathing rate or something at different ages or whatever, you don't need to adjust at all. You just do it as they did it. That's all.
Okay, all right. So we support the way the EPA applies inhalation unit risk. Okay. Any other points for discussion on this point or others? Otherwise, I'll turn it over to Dr. Morris to address any thorny issues that are still coming forward.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Eastman. So I think we've done it. We just have a couple of things to do to wrap this up. I think we'll get a chance to make sure we're comfortable with tier 1, tier 2 recommendations, and then have some clarifying comments from the public, and then we'll go to next steps. So the idea here, just not to rehash everything, but are the lead discussants comfortable with the information that they have? Would they want some more clarification from their panel members before they go back and do their preliminary write-ups? So I think we do that in order for charge question 1 or 2. I think that's Dr. Beck. You feel comfortable moving forward?
Oh, I do, and obviously it'll be a team effort with Dr. Wingarden.
Right, good point. We're all going to see the comments, and these will all be team efforts. Dr. Lash, are you comfortable moving forward?
I think so. I have comments. I don't think there were too many, differences from the preliminary comments. I mean, we noted a few areas of focus that overlap with other charge questions regarding point of departure, and our focus is more on the study selection and species selection, and I got some additional comments from Dr. Rusin on that and the uncertainty factors. And the only thing I would ask is if all the various people who are involved in making comments on 3A through 3I, they could make sure to clearly label to which one, because I know several of you have, multiple sections to try and sort through them all. And I think most of you indicated specific recommendations, because what I'll do is sort of try and bring together the comments for each part of each question, and then have at the end like the specific recommendations, tier 1 and tier 2. So if you have it, I think most did some labeling of that, but in others I could tell that it was a recommendation because it started off like EPA should, or we recommend that EPA does this or that. So that's all, I think, unless anyone else has comments or thoughts from the various 3A through 3I groups.
Okay, that sounds like a plan forward. I would suggest if anyone wants to be included in these team efforts on a specific charge question, they should just let the lead discussant know. Right? Those discussions may include more than the people who are assigned to each question. So feel free to interject if you want to. Dr. Post, question 4, are you ready to move forward?
I guess I wasn't thinking about tier 1 and tier 2 and consensus when we were discussing it yesterday. So this has, Dr. Haney made comments for Mr. Haney made comments for charge question 4, similar to what we were discussing for charge question 6, the statement about looking at the target tissue dose and nonlinearity what we were talking about yesterday at the end of the day. So in his comments, he had similar comments for both cancer effects. That target tissue absorbed dose should be considered as the dose metric in models that appear sublinear over the lower part of the dose response should be considered. They may provide a better fit than the multi-stage degree 1 model. That seems similar to what we voted on yesterday to me, but also he had similar comments on non-cancer effects for the reference dose for the diffuse epithelial hyperplasia of the duodenum in female mice and he has published on the modeling this endpoint on the basis of tissue absorbed dose. His comments suggested that this should also be considered by EPA instead of for BMD modeling, and we didn't discuss if that was in his comments they were tier 2 recommendations, but we didn't discuss if we had consensus on those points for part of the response to charge question 4, I don't think. So I wasn't sure how to handle that, and maybe we could discuss it now.
I thought maybe there was a suggestion, perhaps it was from Dr. Morris, correct me if I'm wrong, that those, and I'd commented that although, I'd put tier 2 in my preliminary comments, there was a suggestion by someone, I think, that they'd be tier 1, and I indicated that I was absolutely fine with that.
That's in my notes, but because we made such a big deal of voting on it later for other things that I wasn't sure if it is, Dr. Morris did say that, sorry, and it is in my notes, but then since we had to vote when we said this almost the same thing for charge question 6, I didn't know if we needed to do something like that as part of our process to put it in as a recommendation here. I just wanted to make sure because it seemed very similar.
I would think, this is John, I would think that if the toxicokinetic considerations are important for the cancer, they're also important for the non-cancer effects. And we could put in the same comment that they need to be considered. I see Dr. Rusin, you've got your hand up.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm wondering if we may need to clearly understand how some of the comments that were a lot longer will be handled, because I think while we reached consensus on some of the points, some others may remain as very voluminous and reflecting an individual commenter view rather than a sense of how the SAB in its entirety felt about it. So maybe we can think of briefer comments where we do have consensus or some point of disagreements to be the main body, and then leave all the very lengthy comments as individual members' opinions. But going through the voluminous comments and agreeing or disagreeing with them, I think is largely impossible, but I also would not want to create a perception that they are the opinion of an SAB rather than an individual member. So can we maybe think about structure of our report now?
Before we get to that, everybody agrees that the same comment in summary applies to non-cancer. I want to make sure, because I guess so. Okay.
I think that was near unanimity.
For non-cancer, we voted for cancer.
Oh, okay.
But the similar comment is in my charge question 4 for non-cancer, so I assume
I would
probably
think it would be the same.
I think so, but we didn't formally. I want to make sure what I write as consensus is consensus.
I would agree with what Dr. Morris said, that
Okay.
the toxicokinetic considerations are important for both non-cancer and cancer. We do know for both of them, to some degree, they've taken this into account. It's whether further toxicokinetic considerations are needed is the issue. If I can comment briefly, at least as far as the structure of the document, the way I see it is, at least the way I'm envisioning charge question 6, because the responses were pretty long. I'm hoping to put sort of a key summary at the top, go through key points below that from the individuals, and then really extensive comments I'd probably put in an appendix. That's so that you know, you don't get bogged down into, you know, you can follow the flow of what the key issues were or the comments, but, you know, it doesn't, it just allows it to be more readable. That's kind of my thinking. If someone thinks that's a problem, please let me know.
So you're thinking of a summary, but then are you thinking of a not quite so summary, but summary of individual comments after that by individual or by topic,
Well,
or?
but probably by, well, I mean, so as I presented the introduction to charge question 6, I kind of summarized overall what people, you know, these individuals supported this, and this. This individual had a different perspective on this. This individual had a different perspective on this. But I don't think that's sufficient, because I think people had valid comments that they made, and those I would allow into the second section where they have important comments. But making sure that those are reasonably concise so it becomes readable. But when things become really long, then those I would put in an appendix so that the information would be there for the EPA to refer to if they wanted or they have access to it, but so that the response is fairly readable. I mean,
Right.
and everyone's going to see this, so if they feel like I've unfairly moved something out or they pushed, you know, this will be a back and forth sort of exchange for sure. But I'm just trying to think of, if I were reading this document, what do I want to know? I want to kind of upfront, what's the bottom line? What are the additional comments about this?
Right.
And then further discussion could be pushed into appendix. And I hope that would be okay.
Yeah, so I'm sorry to perseverate. Your initial summary, you were thinking of doing it by individual, but I'm wondering if rather than saying one person thought this, another person thought that, maybe to say these topics were considered, you know, this topic there was general unanimity, another topic different perspectives were provided, but not tag it to each person, but have it be more big picture. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, the real question is whether people want their names on the specific comments or just say one reviewer or another reviewer, et cetera.
Yeah, we will not be, this is not individual comments. This is a report from the panel. So my suggestion is that the responses be complete. Complete in that the ideas and the conclusions of the panel be presented along with the supporting evidence for those recommendations and comments. So the body of the report should be very complete. Now, if there are very specific additional points of view, then we can certainly point people within the body of the report to an appendix where further elaboration on a particular issue can be found, and deal with those more extensive, detailed comments that come from only one or two individuals that deviate from the consensus of the panel can be housed.
I mean, the challenge I have, Sue, is although it looks like there are only 5 subsections within charge question 6, there are actually about 5 or 6 questions for each of those subsections. So you're really looking at sort of 25 individual questions, and some of them are not relevant and all the rest. So there's a lot of sort of judgment calls that have to be, even interpreting the questions and then integrating this together. So I guess my goal is to try and pull together what I think are the summary comments. Is that I think is easier to do. It's how to deal with the next level of comments, which I think there's general agreement on or we think are valid. And then how to deal with this. So I'll work my way through it, but that's the challenge I have on this particular charge question.
Yeah, I would suggest trying to be as complete as you can, and then there will be an editing process after that. So I think providing more information at this stage is better than trying to exclude information. So we can sort of decipher through things as we go through the iterations of creating this final report. And I think Dr. Lash had a comment, so I'll let him talk.
Yeah, what I was going to comment that my plan was to, because in some cases, some of my sections have 2 to 4 people who've submitted comments, and there is some overlap. So I think like Sue mentioned, we're not going to say like, you know, so-and-so said this, or so-and-so said that. I mean, when there are differences, you might say one reviewer had this opinion, whereas another had this. But when there's overlap, I'm just going to say, or consensus, just aggregate them and say that, you know, there was a concern about this issue that was expressed by several reviewers, and the group agreed that this should be looked into, or whatever, something like that. So that's what I was going to do, put them together in a way that kind of aggregates similar comments, and where there were differences, or where there was something that one person just focused on, just to note that. But I think even the ones where one person, I think we talked about it, and everyone agreed that it was a valid issue. So there was agreement. So that was what I was going to do to kind of make it, I think, like it was described, more of a, because it's a group report, even though individuals make comments. So that's how I was approaching it.
This is John. I think that makes sense, because we all discussed this as a group, and if there were no dissenting opinions at the group, then, you know, it's a reflection of the consensus of the group. So I think you're right on, Dr. Lash.
One thing that I plan to do, or I guess I'll talk, Edwin and I will talk about it together. There were a number of comments that I would consider tier 1 comments, because they're important clarity comments, but they're very specific and very detailed. They don't actually take up a lot of space. Put those in a table or an appendix, but just have a summary of the overall issue and provide an example, and then have the rest in some type of appendix or a table. And just to note, consensus does not mean unanimous.
Right.
I'm obviously new to this process, like I said, and so I don't really have a great idea how this is going to proceed. You know, I assume that our final comments will be a matter of public record. I wouldn't expect that the panel agree with every sentence and everyone's individual comments, but that the report would be a lot more general with the things that there was consensus on. And so, you know, for purposes of my own comments, for example, you know, I just on some of these topics, I was trying to do enough to simply show that these ideas, these topics are worth pursuing, worth taking a look at, you know, and not that, you know, with no expectation that everyone would agree with exactly how I did these types of demonstrations. You know, again, I'm not trying to do the work for anyone, just trying to do enough to demonstrate that these things are worth taking a look at. So yeah, I mean, again, I wouldn't expect that the report would say that everyone concurs with every sentence in any particular reviewer's comments, but rather it would have to be a higher level summary, if you will, of what we agree on that EPA should take a close look at.
Dr. Post?
So my question follows up on what you were saying. A lot, probably other people did too, but I had quite a few specific comments, like on certain pages or tables to clarify, but they're not like really long, not pages and pages. When you were saying about putting them in a table, I was thinking they would go like at the end of each charge question, not a separate table for all of them put together. I wasn't sure what you were suggesting.
I guess I hadn't thought whether, I see a table
Or
or
a
appendix, but I think that as long as we capture them and say this relates to a particular charge question, then I think EPA can decide where to put it. But I do think that all of these detailed comments need to be, captured. And I just want to, I did try to take good notes, but this is probably refers to everyone. If you have any substantial changes from your initial writing, please send them to me and to the other individuals who are in charge of a particular question.
Yeah, they all do have, like, as you said, have to be, the specifics have to be somewhere, whether in a table or somewhere, or they're not counted. Thanks.
So, Dr. Lash?
Yeah, I was just going to say that in thinking back to some other IRIS meetings in the past, that what I was planning on doing is, having a, like you said, like a sort of an overall of that specific charge question or sub-question, and then, the specific comments, and then listing at the end the, like having a subsection recommendations, and then tier 1, 1, 2, 3, whatever, tier 2, so on. Because I think that's how we did it in other reports, so that the specific recommendations, telling the EPA what we think they need to do and what we recommend for improving clarity and so on would be all together. So that's what I think we've done in the past, is my recollection.
I'm just going to let Dr. Bursek, if you have anything that you want to add before you leave the meeting. I see that you're about to depart.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I have to depart, have to catch a flight, and this was one of the reasons I wasn't able to be there in person. Before we circle around in terms of final comments on all the questions, I feel that the comments I received for question 5 were fairly straightforward. I think we had a good, albeit fairly brief discussion on those. I did receive follow-up from a couple people to make sure that their comments were expressed clearly, and I think I have a good understanding of the next steps. So before I leave, if anybody has anything they want to communicate on question 5, maybe we can take a minute or two now. If they're more lengthy or you need more time, feel free to send me an email on that. I want to thank everybody for their contributions. It was clear that everyone carefully considered charge question 5 and was thoughtful in their comments and questions. And I appreciate the clarity on it.
Well, maybe I should talk to Sue about this offline. I mean, I got, as I mentioned, I received a large number of comments and detailed. And some of these comments are really, I think, using individuals' expertise to try and advise the EPA on certain aspects of the document. And it gets down to the specifics such as this cell line has this type of, this functional wild type P53, and that therefore you interpret this data differently. And that's the sort of thing that my goal is to probably push that into an appendix. I think it's valuable EPA receives this and can use it to improve the document, but I don't see it as sort of a group sort of thing. So I'll be making sort of judgment calls in this area and sort of the 3 tiers, and I hope that's okay. I mean, because while it wasn't discussed publicly here, these are valid comments, and I know the individual would like this shared with the EPA, so they will use it to improve the document, that sort of thing. That seem okay?
Yeah, I mean, that's fine. If you feel like the specificity and the granularity of the comments are such that they don't allow for a good flow of for the report itself, then yeah, I mean, they are judgment calls at some level. But I think that the main issue here is to actually look at the charge question and make sure that you are responding to each point within the charge question and to provide the supporting evidence for any recommendations that you make regarding these charge questions. And also, just to reiterate what Dr. Lash brought up, to try to pull out the main sort of distilled recommendations in a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 sort of format at the end of each of those charge questions would be very helpful for EPA, so that when there is the granularity that you're speaking to, the specificity, you don't necessarily have to, read the entire report, but just simply go to those recommendations and understand exactly what it is that you're asking EPA to do, and the importance of those recommendations as being very necessary, sort of a mid-level and then a long-term kind of, separation of those recommendations.
This is John. I think that makes a lot of sense, Sue, that approach, especially at the end, pulling out specifically the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3s. I would also say we're all going to be involved in this process, right? It's going to be iterative amongst all the members of the team and then back to the entire group. So we can work our way through this as we go forward. I'm hearing silence.
Yeah, I don't see any lights on or hands raised. Oh, wait a minute, Dr. Eastman, is your tent? I find the term tent odd. Yeah.
So we're good?
I think we are. I'm not seeing.
All right. This may not be easy, but we'll do it. We'll work our way through it. We do have an opportunity for some clarifying public comments, some brief comments from the public, correct, Sue? Is there?
Yes.
So I thought we'd do that now. I don't know how long that's allowed, 3 minutes, something like that.
Yeah, I think 3 minutes should cover it.
Okay, we'll do that, and then we'll do next steps just to review them. Sue went through them before, but I think I copied them down. She'll correct me if I'm wrong. So let's hear the clarifying public comment. We could.
Okay. Dr. Thompson from Tox Strategies. Thank you.
So I want to thank the chair and EPA for allowing me to have a few minutes to respond to what I think yesterday were a few inconsistencies that I just want to highlight to the group, particularly as it relates to some of the work that we have been involved with. So with regard to TGR assays, yesterday, I think Dr. Zikovic, you raised some concerns about the utility or the validity of TGR assays because of the transgenes being small, inserted into the heterochromatin, okay? On page 169 of your preliminary comments, you stated that it was unclear as to what the reason was for the omission of a study by Ito and Shimada in 1998, bone marrow and liver mutagenesis in LAC-Z transgenic mice treated with hexavalent chromium, because it provides clear evidence for Chrome-6 mutagenicity in mice. This work also showed the importance of timing of tissue collection for mutagenesis studies shortly after exposure for a rapidly dividing tissue. So to me, it's a little unclear why that study clearly shows a mutagenic mode of action in a non-target tissue, but the negative TGR assays in the oral cavity of big blue rats, in the intestine of big blue rats, in the intestine of GPD delta mice, in rapidly dividing site of contact tissues with demonstrable chromium exposure in different species, in different TGR models with positive controls are not considered informative to mode of action. Regarding the gamma H2AX immunostaining discussed by Dr. Wise, in our 7-day GLP study published in Mutation Research, the H2AX immunostaining was not the primary assay. This was a micronucleus study. and notably the positive control cyclophosphamide significantly increased crypt micronuclei, whereas chromium did not. The gamma H2X staining was found in aberrant nuclei within the crypts of mice that had been exposed to cyclophosphamide, but this was not present with Chrome-6. Thus, the gamma H2AX there was a secondary marker of genotoxicity. Given those findings in the 7-day study, the lack of aberrant gamma H2AX immunostaining in the duodenal crypts from the Thompson et al. 2015 study in toxicological science of mice that had been exposed to 180 ppm Chrome-6 for 90 days would seem to indicate a lack of genotoxicity in the crypt. Regarding some back and forth yesterday between Dr. Costa and Mr. Haney about Mr. Haney wanting to see some evidence of genotoxicity in the target tissue, but Dr. Costa was very much in belief that there was DNA repair inhibition must be present in the target tissue, yet the inhibition of DNA repair, with that potentially being there, there does not appear to be any sign of apical evidence of genotoxicity in the TGR or micronucleus studies. And finally, Dr. Rusin, you stated yesterday that Chrome-6 creates a perfect storm in creating genotoxicity, cell proliferation, inflammation, and yet we cannot find genotoxicity in this target tissue. There are published meta-analyses that indicate that a large number of carcinogens have lower benchmark dose values in vivo genotoxicity studies than their benchmark dose values for the CARC endpoint, and that's when you don't even consider tissue concordance. As such, the absence of demonstrable genotoxicity in the target tissue by multiple assays is inconsistent with the mutagenic mode of action. Thank you.
Sue, will we get a copy of these comments?
If Dr. Thompson shares them with us, yes, certainly you will.
Because I was going to say, I tried to take notes, but there was a lot of detail there, so I'd appreciate, I guess the whole others would appreciate a copy with the references.
Sure, okay.
Thank you.
So if anybody has any questions for Dr. Thompson? Okay.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Thompson.
Thank you.
So our last piece of business here, other than thank you for your hard work, is to go through our next steps. So the next step is that we are to provide our revised comments to the lead discussants and copy Sue on all of it because she's coordinating it. And the leads will do a consolidation of what they received and share it with their team members and make sure their team members have consensus on what is said, and hopefully making sure that we answer all the charged questions when we're doing this process. Then this will all get back sent to Sue, and she and I will put together a draft report, which we'll share with the entire panel in a public meeting to go over. And we can do that either at Zoom, or I think you said if we think it's necessary, we could have another face-to-face to go over it and make sure that we're all in agreement. And after that point, we will submit the final draft report to the SAB. Did I get that right, Sue?
Yes, basically that is the process. I'm going to make it a little bit more specific and give out some dates, and then
Perfect.
I will follow up with an email to everyone. So by the time you guys get home, you will have an email that sort of details what the next steps are and how we intend to move forward. So I'm asking that by April 10th, I'm giving you 2 weekends, plus the week in between, to get your revised comments back to me. And so that's April 10th. And then between April 10th and May 1st, I'll try to get these back to lead discussants within, hopefully a 2 to 3 day turnaround, making sure that you have the comments that are associated with your charge questions. And then between that time and May 1st, the lead discussants should be discussing their responses with their team members and anyone else that may have provided comments on their particular assigned charge question. So include those individuals as well. So for example, Dr. Beck and Dr. Van Weingarten are charged are the team members for questions 1 and 2, but others of you may have also provided some comments on those 2 charge questions. So we're asking them to include those individuals in that discussion so that they're characterizing those comments appropriately. And the person who provided those comments feels that their comments were included.
Can I just ask one question for clarification? So those who have not made comments, preliminary comments, but wish to do so after this meeting, they should feel free to send those comments to you to be sent to the lead discussants, right?
Yes. Wow. Excuse me. Anyone that has not currently provided comments on a specific charge question, but after today's meeting finds that they do have additional thoughts, ideas, suggestions for studies, et cetera, please do send those to me, labeling them with the charge question that they are intended to respond to, so that I can provide them to the right individuals. And then you will also be included in that discussion of creating or developing the response to that assigned charge question. So again, by May 1st, I would like to have those comments returned to me. And then I will take a few days to sort of aggregate everything into a single report, and I will share that with Dr. Morris for his review and edits. And then I'm thinking by mid-May, Dr. Morris should have the report to look at, and then hopefully by mid-June, we will have a draft report that I will be posting on our web. Everyone will then be able to see it, including stakeholders and members of the public and EPA representatives will be able to see it at least 30 days in advance of another public meeting. I don't think we will need to meet in person. I will probably be asking for 2 days of maybe 4-hour sections of time. We may finish using just the 1 day. 4 hours may be enough to go through the draft report, and therefore we can cancel the second 4-hour period. But we'll have that additional 4 hours in case we need to flesh out the document more thoroughly. So that I'm hoping to have dates in, I would say, mid to late July as a target for when we actually meet to discuss the draft. So one thing that I want everybody to keep in mind is that you will be basically meeting in teams in a subgroup that will be less than 50% of the panel to discuss your individual responses. And thereby, we do not need to do those deliberations in public. So whenever we have a quorum of our panel discussing the report, discussing responses, deliberating, that has to happen in public. And that is why the panel as a whole will not see the report until it becomes public. So you will not be able to provide comments on other people's responses until we meet as a group. You will be creating and providing comments on the individual charge questions that you are assigned to, or that you have decided to add your thoughts and comments on. Does that make sense? Anybody have any questions?
Yeah, I had a simple clarification question, because I think I heard two different things. Our comments, revising my individual comments, am I giving them to you and you're giving them to the team leader, or am I just giving them straight to the team leader?
I need to be CC'd either way.
Okay.
So whether you're giving them directly to the team leader or just to me, and I can move them on to the team leads, either way, I have to be CC'd.
No problem.
Yeah.
All right. What's the date for that?
That is April 10th.
That's April 10th, okay.
And we're supposed to copy you on all the email discussions among our little team groups too, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Once the team leads get to the point where they are now trying to develop the response to the charge questions, I will be CC'd along with any members within your team that you are seeking input from. Dr. Eastman?
So I'm a team leader. If I make changes to my initial comments, which I've done, I should send that to you, even though it's coming back to me, but you need a copy of it. So any changes, summary changes, I should send to you.
To be thorough, yes. I think that would be a good idea. Anyone online have any questions? No? Okay.
I'm sorry, just
Dr. King.
one more time, because that was a lot. All of us, our initial change, or our changes post-meeting by the 10th. Lead discussants try to get to you by May 1st. Is that what you said?
That is correct. And again, I'll be sending this in an email, so don't worry, you don't have to memorize anything. You'll get an email from me and to sort of explain the next steps and the dates and the milestones. Dr.
Okay,
Morris, do you have anything that you want to add?
I'm good. I would just like to thank everyone for their efforts so far and hope they continue to work hard as we move forward.
And I think we should all give Dr. Morris a big round of applause for being here after surgery. And, I think you've done a great job as a group leader. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
No applause.
Whatever.
Okay, well, thank you to Dr. Morris. Thank you, Dr. Beck, for being our in-house co-chair. And thank you to everyone for your participation and a great discussion. And again, please be on the lookout for my email, and I look forward to the next steps. And I'll also be going out with a request for dates so that we can sort of lock down. I know July is not the ideal time for us to meet, but unfortunately that's how things go. So hopefully working around your vacation times and family time and all of that. And we can find 2 4-hour sections within a close enough proximity so that we can meet and discuss our draft report. Any other questions before we adjourn? Okay, seeing none. We are adjourned. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank y'all.
Thank you. Bye.